In 1887, Montana, a woman's hair was her crown, her dignity. But for Clara O'Malley, standing in a freezing general store with a starving 5-year-old tugging at her skirt, that long red hair was just currency. She raised the shears to her scalp, ready to trade her beauty for a single sack of flour. The town watched in silence. The store owner smirked, but before the blades could close, a hand like a bear trap caught her wrist. A voice deep as a mine shaft rumbled from the shadows. "Put the metal down, ma'am. Keep the hair. I'll feed you both." They thought he was her savior. They were dead wrong. The man who took her up the mountain wasn't a hero. He was the one man in the territory who had a secret reason to fear her dead husband. Banshee Creek, Montana Territory, November 1887. The wind in Banshee Creek didn't just blow. It bit. It chewed through wool coats and found the marrow of your bones. For Clara O'Malley, the cold was a secondary enemy. The primary enemy was the hollow, grinding silence of her son's stomach. Clara stood inside Paddock's General Mercantile. The heat from the pot-belly stove doing little to stop her trembling. She was 24, though the harsh frontier sun and the grief of the last 6 months made her look older. Her husband Liam had vanished in the high country, while prospecting for silver, leaving her with nothing but a drafty shack and a dwindling hope that he was still alive. That hope had died with the first heavy snow. Now, she was just the widow O'Malley. $2, Josiah Paddock said, leaning over the counter. He was a soft man in a hard land, his waistline evidence of his greed. He wiped his hands on a stained apron. "Price of flour's gone up, Clara. Supply and demand. Snow's closed the pass." Clara clutched her son Toby closer to her leg. The boy was pale, his eyes too big for his face. "Mr. Paddock, please. I have 50 cents. I can scrub the floors. I can mending. I don't need floors scrubbed." Paddock sneered, his eyes traveling up to the thick copper-red braid that fell over Clara's shoulder. It was the only vibrant thing left about her. "But there is a wig maker in St. Louis paying a premium for red hair. Uncut. Virgin quality." The store went quiet. 3 miners playing cards in the corner stopped to watch. The humiliation burned hotter than the stove. To cut a woman's hair was to strip her of her femininity, to mark her as desperate or fallen. "My hair," Clara whispered. "Cut it off right here," Paddock said, sliding a pair of heavy, rusted iron shears across the counter. "And I'll give you a 10-pound sack of flour and a tin of lard. That keeps the boy alive another week." Toby looked up at her, tugging her dress. "Mama, I'm hungry." That broke her. Clara reached out her fingers, shaking, and picked up the cold iron. She undid the ribbon holding her braid. Her hair spilled down a cascade of copper fire against her drab grey dress. She opened the blades. The sound of the metal grinding together was nauseating. She brought the cold steel to her neck. She closed her eyes. Clang! A heavy calloused hand slammed onto the counter, knocking the shears from her grip. They skittered across the wood and fell to the floor. Clara gasped, jumping back. Towering over her was a man who looked more like a grizzly, standing on hind legs than a human being. He wore a coat made of buffalo hide, the fur matted with snow. His beard was a thicket of black and grey, hiding half his face, but his eyes, steel grey and terrifyingly sharp, were visible. He smelled of pine resin, gunpowder, and old blood. The store went deadly silent. Even Paddock took a step back. "Jericho," Paddock stammered. I didn't hear the door." Jericho Kincaid, the mountain man of Devil's Peak. Rumors said he'd killed more men than smallpox. They said he lived so high up the mountain, Even the wolves didn't bother him. Jericho ignored the store owner. He looked down at Clara. He didn't look at her with lust or pity. He looked at her with a strange, haunted recognition. He looked at Toby, and his jaw tightened. "You don't shear a woman like a sheep, Paddock," Jericho growled. His voice sounded like gravel crunching under a boot. "It's a fair trade," Paddock defended, though his voice squeaked. "She has no money." Jericho reached into his coat and slammed a heavy leather pouch onto the counter. The sound of gold dust hitting wood was unmistakable. "Fill the wagon out front," Jericho commanded. "Flour, bacon, beans, coffee, sugar, and warm blankets. 2 sets." He turned to Clara. "Put your hair up, woman. You look like a spectacle." Clara fumbled with her ribbon heart hammering. "Sir, I can't repay you. I have nothing." Jericho looked her up and down, his eyes hard. "I didn't ask for payment. Get the boy. You're coming with me." "With you?" Clara recoiled. "To the mountain." "Unless you want to freeze to death in that shack of yours down in the valley," Jericho said, turning his back on her. "Storm's coming tonight. A killer. Paddock's flour won't keep the wind out of your walls. My cabin will." He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "You coming, or are you cutting?" Clara looked at the shears on the floor. She looked at Paddock, whose eyes promised retribution later if she stayed. She looked at Toby, shivering. She grabbed Toby's hand. "We're coming." The ascent to Devil's Peak. The journey up the mountain was a brutal awakening. Jericho Kincaid rode a massive black draft horse named Judge, while Clara and Toby sat in the small buckboard wagon hitched behind it. The road wasn't a road. It was a scar cut into the side of the cliff. As they ascended, the air grew thin and sharp. The pine trees became denser, blocking out the fading afternoon light. Clara clutched Toby under the new wool blankets Jericho had bought. "Mama, is he a bad man?" Toby whispered, peering at the broad back of the man driving the wagon. "I don't know, baby," Clara whispered back. "But he has food." They arrived at the cabin just as the first heavy flakes of the blizzard began to swirl. It wasn't a cabin so much as a fortress. Built of massive logs notched perfectly together, it sat on a plateau overlooking the entire valley. A lean-to stable was attached to the side. Jericho unhitched the horse with practiced efficiency. "Inside, don't touch anything on the mantel." Clara ushered Toby inside. The warmth hit them instantly. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, the embers glowing red. The furniture was rough-hewn but sturdy. But what caught Clara's eye were the walls. They were lined with pelts, bear wolf cougar, and weapons. Several rifles, a shotgun, and knives of various sizes. And books. Hundreds of books, stacked on the floor on shelves on the table. Shakespeare, Plato, military strategy. Jericho entered, stomping the snow off his boots. He carried 2 sacks of flour on one shoulder as if they weighed nothing. He dropped them in the corner. "There's a loft." He pointed a gloved finger upward. "You and the boy sleep there. I sleep down here. You cook, I hunt. You clean, I chop wood. We stay out of each other's way until the thaw. Understand?" "Mr. Kincaid," Clara said, her voice steadying. "Why? Why did you help us?" Jericho stopped. He was taking off his buffalo coat, revealing a faded blue flannel shirt strained against broad shoulders. He turned slowly. For a second, Clara thought she saw a flash of pain in those steel eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Because Liam O'Malley was a fool," Jericho said flatly. But he didn't deserve to have his wife balded by a rat like Paddock. Clara froze. You knew Liam. Everybody knew Liam. Jericho grunted, turning away to stoke the fire. Loud, optimistic, reckless. He was a good man, Clara defended hotly. Good men die young in this territory, Mrs. O'Malley. Smart men survive. The tension in the room was palpable. Clara realized then that she hadn't been rescued by a knight. She was trapped in a cage with a wild animal who clearly despised her late husband. That night, lying in the loft on a mattress stuffed with straw and lavender, Clara listened to the wind howl outside. Below, she heard Jericho pacing, back and forth, like a sentry on guard duty. She fell asleep clutching Toby, unaware that in the darkness below her Jericho was holding a silver locket in his hand, a locket that didn't belong to him. He clicked it open, stared at the picture inside, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Liam. I'm trying." 3 weeks later, December 1887. The snow had buried the world. The drifts were 6 feet high against the cabin walls. Life in the cabin had settled into a tense rhythm. Clara cooked stews with the venison Jericho brought home. She baked bread, real warm bread, that made Toby's cheeks fill out and return to a healthy pink. Jericho spoke little. He would disappear at dawn and return at dusk, sometimes with game, sometimes with nothing but a darker mood. But Clara watched him. She noticed things. She noticed how he always checked the perimeter of the cabin before entering. She noticed the scar that ran from his collarbone up to his ear, hidden mostly by his beard. And she noticed how gentle he was with Toby when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, Toby was sitting on the bearskin rug, struggling to whittle a stick with a dull kitchen knife. Jericho, who was cleaning his Winchester 1873 rifle by the fire, watched him for a long time. Finally, he set the gun down. "You're going to cut your thumb off, boy," Jericho rumbled. Toby jumped. "I'm making a sword," Jericho snorted. He reached into his boot and pulled out a knife with a handle made of elk antler. It was razor sharp. He moved from his chair to the floor, sitting cross-legged next to the boy. The size difference was comical, a mountain next to a molehill. "Hold the wood like this," Jericho instructed his giant hands, guiding Toby's small ones. "Slice away from you, always away. Unless you're fighting a man, then you slice up." Clara, mending a shirt by the lantern, stopped breathing. She wanted to intervene to tell him not to teach her son violence, but she saw the look on Toby's face. It was pure adoration. Toby had never had a father figure. Liam had been gone prospecting most of Toby's life. "Did you know my papa?" Toby asked innocently. Jericho's hand froze on the wood. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. "I knew him," Jericho said softly. "Was he a hero?" Jericho looked up, locking eyes with Clara across the room. The firelight cast dancing shadows on his face. "He was brave. He wasn't afraid of the dark." Later that night, the peace was shattered. A howl erupted from just outside the heavy oak door. Then another. Then a snarl that vibrated the floorboards. Jericho was out of his chair in a blur, the Winchester in his hands before Clara could even gasp. "Get in the loft," he barked. "Take the boy. Hide." "What is it?" Clara cried, grabbing Toby. "Wolves," Jericho said. "But not a normal pack. They're hungry, and they smell the venison in the smokehouse." The sound of wood splintering came from the side of the cabin, the attached stable where Judge the horse was kept. "Damn it!" Jericho cursed. He threw the heavy bolt on the front door. "They're going for the horse." Without a horse, they were trapped until spring. If the horse died, they had no way to haul wood or escape if the food ran out. Jericho grabbed a lantern and his rifle. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it unless you hear my voice, if I don't come back in 10 minutes. There's a Colt revolver under my pillow. You know how to use it. Point and pull," Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Aim for the center of mass. Don't hesitate." Jericho threw the door open and vanished into the swirling white hell. Clara slammed the door and threw the bolt, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, gunfire erupted. Crack, crack, crack. The screams of wolves mixed with the terrified whinnying of the horse. Then a human shout of pain. "Jericho!" Clara screamed. She waited. 1 minute. 2. The shooting stopped. The howling faded into the distance. "Open the door!" Jericho's voice roared, strained and breathless. Clara threw the bolt. Jericho stumbled in, covered in snow and blood. He dragged himself to the fire and collapsed into the chair. His left arm was shredded, the sleeve of his coat torn away, revealing deep, gashing bite marks that were pouring blood onto the floor. "You're hurt," Clara rushed to him, tearing strips from her apron. "Saved the horse." Jericho gritted out his face, pale sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "3 of them. Big ones." "Let me see the arm," Clara commanded. She had been a miner's wife. She had seen injuries before. "It's fine." Jericho tried to push her away. "It is not fine. It needs cleaning and stitching or you'll lose the arm to rot." Clara snapped. Her fear had evaporated, replaced by a fierce determination. "Toby, bring me the whiskey and the sewing kit from the top shelf. Now." For the next hour, Clara O'Malley became the surgeon. She poured whiskey into the jagged wounds. Jericho roared through his teeth, but didn't pull away, and began to stitch the flesh back together. She was close to him. She could smell the musk of him, feel the heat radiating off his body. He watched her face as she worked his eyes, tracing the line of her jaw, the concentration in her brow. "You got steady hands, Clara," he whispered. It was the first time he had used her first name. "You saved our lives tonight, Jericho," she replied softly, tying off the last stitch. She looked up, and their faces were inches apart. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a raw, magnetic tension in its wake. "I promised," he mumbled, his eyes half closing from the pain and the whiskey. "Promised who?" Clara asked. Jericho's head lolled back. "Promised him. Promised Liam. If I couldn't save him, I'd save you." Clara froze the bloody rag in her hand. Save him from what Jericho Liam died in a rock slide. That's what the sheriff said. Jericho didn't answer. He had passed out. But as Clara cleaned the blood from his arm, she saw a tattoo on his forearm, previously hidden by his sleeves. It was a brand, actually. A specific brand used by the U.S. Marshals. And beneath the brand, a scar that looked like a bullet hole. An old one. Why was a U.S. Marshal living like a hermit on a mountain? And why did he feel guilty about Liam? Clara went to his coat, lying in a heap by the door. She checked the pockets. She found a crumpled, water-stained letter. It was dated 6 months ago. The handwriting was jagged, hasty. "To Jericho, I found it. The motherlode. But Paddock knows. He's sending men. If I don't make it back to Banshee Creek, the map is in the locket. Protect Clara. Don't let them get the boy." Liam. Clara's world tilted. Liam hadn't died in an accident. He was murdered. And the man sleeping in the chair, Jericho knew everything. But did he kill Liam for the gold? Or was he the only thing standing between Clara and the men who did the cabin at Devil's Peak? January 1888. Morning broke with a deceptive calm. The sun glared off the white snow, blinding and brilliant, but inside the cabin, the air was heavy with the storm of Clara's discovery. Jericho lay on the bearskin rug near the fire, his fever having broken during the night. His arm was bandaged, the red stain seeping through the white linen, but his breathing was steady. He looked less like a monster now, and more like a man carved from rock and battered by the elements. Clara sat in the rocking chair, the Winchester rifle across her lap. She hadn't slept. In her hand, she clenched the crumpled letter from Liam. Paddock knows. The map is in the locket. When Jericho's eyes fluttered open, they instantly locked onto the rifle barrel pointed at his chest. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his own gun. He just stared at her with those grey, knowing eyes. "Coffee's on the stove," he rasped, his voice rough from smoke and pain. "I found the letter," Clara said, her voice trembling, but hard. "In your coat." Jericho pushed himself up to a sitting position, wincing as his stitched arm took his weight. He leaned back against the stone hearth. "I figured you would eventually." "You lied to me," Clara accused. "You said Liam died in a rock slide. You said you were just a hermit living on this rock. But you're a marshal. Or you were." Jericho sighed a deep, rattling sound. "My name was Ethan Cole, U.S. Marshal, Nevada Territory. I turned in the badge 2 years ago after I killed a boy who didn't deserve it. I came here to forget. To die, maybe. Then I met Liam." "Did you kill my husband?" Clara demanded, cocking the lever of the rifle. "No," Jericho said firmly. "I tried to save him. Liam came to me 6 months ago. He'd found a vein of gold in the Blackwood Ridge, pure, thick veins. He called it the Seraphim, but he made the mistake of buying supplies on credit from Josiah Paddock." Jericho reached for the coffee pot with his good hand, pouring a cup and taking a sip before continuing. "Paddock isn't just a storekeep, Clara. He fronts for the railroad syndicate. He has a gang of regulators hired killers on his payroll. When Liam couldn't pay his tab, he offered a share of the mine. Paddock didn't want a share. He wanted it all." Clara lowered the rifle slightly. "So what happened?" "Liam came to me for help. We went up to the ridge to stake the claim properly. But Paddock's head regulator, a man named Boone Ricketts, followed us. They ambushed us in the canyon. I took a bullet in the shoulder, that scar you saw. Liam took 2 in the chest. He fell into the river. The current took him before I could get to him. Boone thinks the map died with Liam. I've been hunting Boone and Paddock ever since, waiting for them to slip up." Tears streamed down Clara's face. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because if you knew, you'd go to the sheriff. And the sheriff belongs to Paddock," Jericho said grimly. "And because I promised Liam I'd keep you alive. The moment you walked into that store to sell your hair, I knew Paddock was testing you. He was seeing if you were desperate, seeing if you knew where the gold was." Clara's hand flew to her throat, clutching the silver oval hanging there. "The locket. He gave this to me before he left. He said it was a picture of his mother." Jericho nodded. "Open it. Not the picture side. The back. There's a false panel. You need a knife tip to pry it." Clara set the rifle down. She took the locket off and used the small paring knife from the table. With a click, the back of the silver casing popped open. Folded inside, impossibly small, was a piece of onion skin paper. Clara unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a map of Blackwood Ridge with a red X marking a cave system known as the Devil's Throat. "The Seraphim," Jericho whispered. "That paper is worth $1 million, and it's the reason Paddock wanted to shear you. He wanted to humiliate you, break you so you'd leave town or sell the shack. He didn't know you were wearing the map around your neck." Clara looked at the map, then at Jericho. "We have to burn it." Jericho looked shocked. "What? It killed Liam. It almost killed you. I don't want the gold, Jericho. I want my son to grow up." Jericho stood up, unsteady but towering. He crossed the room and gently took the map from her hands. His touch was warm. "We can't burn it, Clara. If we do, Paddock wins. He'll never stop coming for you, thinking you know where it is. The only way to end this is to file the claim in the federal court in Helena. Once it's legal, Paddock can't touch it without bringing down the U.S. Army." He looked down at her, his expression softening. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her copper hair behind her ear. The intimacy of the gesture sucked the air out of the room. "I won't let them hurt you," he vowed. "I've been alone a long time, Clara. I thought I was dead inside. But watching you these last weeks, watching you fight for that boy, watching you stitch me up." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything. He was a man who had forgotten how to love, suddenly remembering. Clara stepped closer, her hand resting on his chest over his heart. "Then we go to Helena. Together." Jericho leaned down. His lips brushed her forehead, a chaste protective kiss that burned hotter than the fire. "When the snow melts, we ride." The Thaw. March 1888. The thaw came not with a whisper, but with the roar of rushing water. The icicles clinging to the eaves of the cabin dripped like ticking clocks. The pass was opening. Jericho spent the weeks prepping. He cleaned the guns daily. He taught Clara how to shoot the Winchester, not just point and pull, but how to account for wind and drop. She was a natural marksman. Her hands were steady, born of years of threading needles and gutting fish. Toby thrived. He followed Jericho around like a shadow. Jericho had carved him a wooden horse, detailed down to the saddlebags. The boy looked at the mountain man, as if he hung the moon. But the peace was fragile. One afternoon, Jericho was in the stable shoeing Judge. Clara was hanging laundry on a line stretched between two pines. The air smelled of mud and pine sap. Suddenly the birds stopped singing. Jericho appeared at the stable door, a hammer in his hand. He tilted his head. "Get inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What is it?" Clara asked, dropping a wet sheet. "Horses, shod with iron, coming up the switchback. 3, maybe 4 riders." He grabbed Clara's arm and hustled her into the cabin. "Bar the door. Get the boy into the root cellar under the floorboards. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Jericho, go." Jericho didn't go inside. He grabbed his Winchester and walked out to the center of the clearing, standing tall, waiting. 10 minutes later, the riders crested the ridge. There were 4 of them. Leading them was Boone Ricketts, a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes like a reptile. He wore a long duster coat and dual navy colts on his hips. Flanking him were 3 hired guns, hard men with dusty faces and itchy trigger fingers. "Well, well," Boone drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "If it isn't the ghost of Devil's Peak. Paddock said you were up here playing house with the widow." "Turn around, Boone," Jericho said calmly, levering around into the chamber of his rifle. "Pass isn't open for rats yet." Boone laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "We ain't here for the view, Kincaid. We're here for the redhead and the locket she's wearing. Boss man is tired of waiting." "She's not here," Jericho lied. "She died in the freeze. Took the boy and the locket with her." Boone's eyes narrowed. He looked at the laundry on the line, a woman's dress, a small boy's shirt. "You were always a bad liar, Marshal. That laundry looks mighty fresh." Boone raised his hand. "Burn it down." The three men behind him drew their weapons. Bang Jericho fired from the hip. One of the riders flew backward off his horse, a hole in his chest. Chaos erupted. Boone's horse reared. The other two men opened fire. Jericho dove behind the woodpile as bullets chewed up the logs. Inside the cabin, Clara huddled in the dark root cellar, with Toby listening to the war outside. She heard the thud, thud, thud of bullets hitting the heavy oak door. She heard Jericho shouting. Then she smelled smoke. "Mama!" Toby whimpered. "Shh." Clara pressed her hand over his mouth. She looked up at the cracks in the floorboards. Wisps of grey smoke were curling up. They had thrown a torch onto the roof. Clara made a choice. If she stayed, they burned. If she went out, they might die. But at least Jericho would have a fighting chance. She pushed the trapdoor open. "Stay here, Toby. Count to 100. Clara grabbed the shotgun Jericho had left by the stove. She kicked the front door open. The scene was a nightmare. The roof was crackling with flames. Jericho was pinned down behind the woodpile, blood streaming from a graze on his cheek. Two gunmen were flanking him. Clara didn't think. She stepped onto the porch, raised the shotgun, and fired. The spread of buckshot caught the nearest gunman in the leg. He screamed and went down. "Clara, get to back!" Jericho roared. Boone Ricketts turned his horse, seeing Clara. He smiled a cruel, victorious smile. He spurred his horse not away, but toward her. He leaned down, ignoring the shotgun she was trying to reload, and swung the butt of his pistol. It connected with Clara's temple. The world exploded in white light, then faded to black. She crumpled to the porch. "Clara!" Jericho abandoned his cover, sprinting across the open ground. Boone leveled his Colt at Clara's unconscious head. "Take another step. Kincaid and I paint the porch with her brains." Jericho skidded to a halt, chest heaving. He stood 10 feet away, his rifle in hand. He could shoot Boone, but Boone's finger was already tightening on the trigger. At this range, even a dead man could reflexively fire. "Drop it," Boone commanded. Jericho looked at Clara lying still in the snow. He looked at the burning cabin where Toby was hiding. Slowly, Jericho Kincaid dropped the Winchester. He raised his hands. "Smart boy," Boone sneered. He signaled the remaining gunman. "Tie him up and put the fire out. Paddock wants them alive. We got a public hanging to schedule." Banshee Creek, 2 days later. The descent from Devil's Peak was a slow, agonizing parade of cruelty. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a piercing, indifferent blue. But the mud on the trail was thick and freezing. Jericho Kincaid, the man who was rumored to be more mountain than flesh, was stumbling. His hands were bound behind his back with raw rawhide that had tightened as it dried, biting deep into his wrists. A heavy iron chain connected his bindings to the saddle horn of Boone Ricketts's horse. Every time the horse surged forward, Jericho was jerked off balance, forced to jog or be dragged through the slush. Behind him, the buckboard wagon creaked and groaned. Clara sat on the hard bench, her arm wrapped protectively around Toby. Her temple throbbed where Boone had struck her. the bruise now a dark, ugly purple that spread to her cheekbone. She kept her head high, refusing to give her captors the satisfaction of seeing her cry, but inside she was screaming. They hit the outskirts of Banshee Creek at noon. The town didn't cheer. Word had spread like a prairie fire that Paddock's regulators had gone up the mountain. As the procession rolled onto Main Street, the saloon emptied. Shopkeepers stepped out onto boardwalks. Women pulled their children behind their skirts. It was a gauntlet of eyes. They saw the legend of the territory, Jericho Kincaid, beaten bloody and chained like a rabid dog. They saw the widow O'Malley, a woman they had watched starve all winter, now looking like a prisoner of war. Josiah Paddock waited on the raised porch of his mercantile. He wore a pristine wool coat and a silk tie, a stark contrast to the filth and blood in the street. He looked like a spider sitting in the center of a very expensive web. "Bring them here," Paddock's voice boomed, authoritative and slick. Boone spurred his horse. The sudden jerk pulled Jericho forward, and his legs, exhausted from the 10-mile trek, finally gave out. He hit the mud hard. A gasp went through the crowd. "Look at him," Paddock sneered, descending the stairs to stand over the fallen mountain man. "The king of Devil's Peak. You don't look like much now, Kincaid." Jericho spat a mouthful of bloody mud onto Paddock's polished boot. "I look like a man who knows the truth, Josiah. That's more than you can say." Paddock's face tightened. He kicked Jericho in the ribs, a sharp, vicious blow that made Toby cry out from the wagon. "Sheriff Miller!" Paddock shouted. The sheriff, a paunchy man with weak eyes and a weaker chin, shuffled forward. He avoided looking at Jericho. He knew, as everyone did, that he was Paddock's property. "Arrest this man," Paddock announced to the town, his voice pitching up for theatrical effect. "For the murder of Liam O'Malley. And arrest this woman as his accomplice." "Liar!" Clara stood up in the wagon, her voice cracking with fury. "You killed Liam. You sent Boone to do it because he wouldn't sell the mine. We found the letter." The crowd murmured. The accusation hung heavy in the cold air. Paddock didn't flinch. He walked calm and slow to the wagon. A letter, or a forgery made by a desperate widow and her lover. He reached up and snatched the silver locket from Clara's neck. The chain snapped with a sharp ping. "No!" Clara lunged, but the guard shoved her back. Paddock held the locket up to the light. He pried it open, dug his fingernail under the false back, and pulled out the thin onion skin map. "See?" Paddock turned to the crowd, waving the map. "This is the deed to the mine Liam promised to me to settle his debts. They stole it. They killed him to keep it. I'm just a businessman trying to see justice done." He pocketed the map and the locket. "Lock the man in the cell. Put the woman and the boy in the dry goods storage room. No food, no water. Trial at dawn. Hanging at noon." As the sheriff hauled Jericho to his feet, the mountain man locked eyes with Clara. He didn't look defeated. His grey eyes were burning with a terrifying cold intelligence. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Wait." The jailhouse, 11:00 p.m. The Banshee Creek jail was a stone box that smelled of stale urine and old tobacco. Jericho sat on the cot in the darkness. They had taken his buffalo coat, his boots, and his weapons. They thought he was helpless. But Jericho Kincaid had spent 10 years tracking fugitives across the Nevada desert. He had learned a few things from the men he caught. He sat with his back to the bars, listening. In the office, Sheriff Miller was celebrating his arrest with a bottle of rye. The clink of the bottle against the glass became rhythmic. Then silence. Then the heavy, wet snore of a drunkard. Jericho moved. He didn't panic. He focused. He reached into his mouth and used his tongue to dislodge a small, thin piece of metal wedged between his gum and cheek. It was a pin from his belt buckle snapped off and hidden hours ago. He slid his hands around his legs to bring them in front of him. He inserted the makeshift pick into the padlock of his shackles. He worked by feel. The mechanism was rusted stubborn. Come on, he thought, sweat beading on his forehead. Click. The iron cuffs fell away. Jericho stood rubbing his raw wrists. He moved to the cell door. This lock was better oiled. It took him 30 seconds. Click. The door swung open with a groan that sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet jail. Jericho froze. In the office, the sheriff snorted, shifted in his chair, and settled back into sleep. Jericho crept into the office like a ghost. He stood over Sheriff Miller. For a second, his hand hovered over the sheriff's gun belt. He could end it here. But Jericho wasn't a murderer. He balled his massive fist and delivered a single, calculated blow to the sheriff's temple. Miller slumped deeper into unconsciousness. He wouldn't wake up until tomorrow. Jericho worked fast. He retrieved his boots. He took the keys. He grabbed a double-barreled shotgun from the rack and a handful of shells. He slipped out the back door into the freezing night. He didn't run for the mountains. He turned toward the mercantile. The mercantile. Midnight. Clara huddled on a pile of grain sacks in the storage room. It was pitch black. Toby was asleep, his head in her lap twitching in a nightmare. Clara was plotting. She had a heavy iron skillet she'd pulled from a display hook. If Paddock opened that door, she was going to swing until she couldn't lift her arms. She heard a sound. Not the heavy tread of a guard, but a soft scratch at the lock. She gripped the skillet handle with both hands, raising it high. The door creaked open. A shadow filled the frame. Clara swung. A hand caught her wrist in mid-air, a grip like iron, but gentle. "Easy, Tiger," a familiar, gravelly voice whispered. "Jericho." Clara dropped the skillet, her knees giving way with relief. She fell into him, burying her face in his chest. He smelled of mud and gun oil, but to her it was the best smell in the world. "We have to go," she whispered, pulling back. "There are horses at the livery. If we ride now, we can make the pass before dawn." "No," Jericho said. His voice was hard, final. Clara blinked, trying to see his face in the dark. "What, Jericho, they're going to hang us." "If we run, we're fugitives," Jericho said, crouching down to check on Toby. "Paddock keeps the mine. He wins, and he'll send men after us forever. I'm done running, Clara." "So what do we do? We can't fight an army." Jericho stood up, the shotgun resting easily in the crook of his arm. A wolfish grin cut through his beard. "We don't need to fight an army. We just need to change the landscape." He handed her a heavy revolver he'd lifted from the sheriff's office. "Do you trust me?" Clara looked at the gun, then at the man who had walked into fire for her. "With my life." "Good," Jericho said, turning toward the door. "Because we're going to rob the bank." Clara's jaw dropped. "The bank. We need money." "Not money," Jericho said, opening the door and checking the alleyway. "Mining supplies, specifically the high-grade dynamite they keep in the vault for the blasting crews. We're going to blow the lid off this whole thing. Literally." Banshee Creek Bank, 3:00 a.m. The town was a graveyard of silence, save for the howling wind that rattled the shutters of the mining bank. Jericho moved with the eerie quiet of a predator. He didn't pick the lock of the bank's front door. That would take too long. Instead, he boosted Clara up to a second-story window. She slipped the latch with the knife, sliding the sash up. "Find the mining supply locker," Jericho whispered from the alley below. "Red sticks, fuses, and caps. Don't drop them, or we'll be the first people in orbit." Clara lowered herself inside. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't a thief. She was a mother, a widow, a survivor. But looking at the bruise on her arm and thinking of Toby shivering in that cold storage room, she felt a cold rage harden in her gut. She found the locker. She grabbed a crate of dynamite, heavy, smelling of sawdust and nitroglycerin. She lowered it down to Jericho using a curtain cord. He caught it as if it were made of glass. "We have everything," Clara whispered, climbing down. "Enough to blow the gates of hell." Jericho grunted. "Now we ride. We have to beat Paddock to the ridge." They stole 2 horses from the livery stable, leaving a gold nugget on the anvil as payment, because Jericho refused to be a horse thief. With Toby secured between Jericho and the saddle horn, they galloped out of town, racing the rising sun, toward the jagged silhouette of Blackwood Ridge the Ascent, 5:30 a.m. The Devil's Throat was a canyon that looked exactly as named, a jagged, gaping maw in the earth, where the river roared hundreds of feet below. The entrance to the Seraphim mine was a cave mouth halfway down the cliff face, accessible only by a narrow, treacherous goat path. They arrived just as the sky turned a bruised purple. Jericho worked fast. He didn't place the dynamite in the mine itself. He climbed the cliffs above the entrance, jamming sticks of dynamite into the natural fissures of the overhanging rock. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, holding Toby back from the edge. "Paddock wants the gold," Jericho said, wiring the fuses together. "He's going to walk right into the throat to get it. When he does, I blow the overhang. It won't kill them if I time it right, but it will seal the path behind them. They'll be trapped on the ledge. No way up, no way down." He handed the detonator wire to Clara. "You hide in the tree line. If I give the signal, you touch this wire to the battery." "Where will you be?" "Down there," Jericho said, checking his shotgun. "Waiting." The trap, 7:00 a.m. The sun crested the peaks, bathing the snow in blinding gold light. The sound of hooves echoed off the canyon walls. Paddock arrived in a carriage, flanked by Boone Ricketts and 6 mounted regulators. They looked confident, arrogant. Paddock held the map in his gloved hands, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "There it is," Paddock shouted, pointing to the cave mouth. "The Seraphim. It's real." "Leave the horses," Boone commanded the men. "It's too steep. We walk." They began the descent down the narrow path, single file. Boone took the lead, Paddock in the middle, the hired guns bringing up the rear. Jericho watched from the shadows of the mine entrance. He stepped out just as Boone's boot hit the flat ledge in front of the cave. "Morning, Boone," Jericho said, casually, leaning against the rock wall. Boone froze. The men behind him reached for their guns, but the path was too narrow. They were blocking each other's lines of fire. "Kincaid!" Paddock gasped, pushing his way to the front. "How in God's name?" "I told you, Josiah," Jericho said, his voice echoing in the canyon. "I'm the ghost of Devil's Peak. You can't kill a ghost." "Kill him!" Paddock shrieked. Boone drew his Colt, but Jericho was faster. He didn't shoot Boone. He fired the shotgun into the air. Boom! The shot wasn't the attack. It was the signal. Up in the tree line, Clara touched the wire to the battery. Crack! Boom! The explosion above them was deafening. The cliff face shuddered. Tons of snow, rock, and shale cascaded down, slamming into the path behind the regulators. The men screamed as the trail they had just walked on was wiped away, crumbling into the abyss below. When the dust settled, Paddock, Boone, and their 6 men were trapped on the ledge. It was a platform of rock no bigger than a large room, suspended over a 300-foot drop, and the only way out was through Jericho Kincaid. Now. Jericho threw the empty shotgun aside and drew his hunting knife. We talk. The Judgment Paddock was hyperventilating, pressing his back against the cold stone. You're crazy, Kincaid. You've killed us all. No. Jericho stepped forward. I just leveled the playing field. No regulators, no corrupt sheriff. Just us. Boone Ricketts looked at the blocked path, then at Jericho. He holstered his gun slowly. He knew shooting Jericho wouldn't save them now. He smiled, pulling a massive Bowie knife from his belt. I've been wanting to gut you for 5 years, Marshal, Boone hissed. Come on then, Jericho beckoned. The fight was brutal and short. Boone lunged a flurry of steel. Jericho sidestepped the buffalo coat, taking the slice. Jericho grabbed Boone's wrist, twisting it with the strength of a man who wrestled bears. There was a sickening snap. Boone screamed, dropping the knife. Jericho spun him around and slammed him face first into the rock wall. That's for Liam, Jericho growled. He tossed Boone to the ground unconscious. The other 6 gunmen raised their hands instantly. They weren't paid enough to fight a demon on a cliff edge. Jericho turned his gaze to Josiah Paddock. The store owner was trembling, clutching the map to his chest like a shield. Please, Paddock whimpered. I'll give you half. I'll give you 70%. I don't want your money, Josiah, Jericho said, stepping closer. I want the truth. Did you order the hit on Liam O'Malley? Paddock looked at the drop behind him. He looked at Jericho's eyes. It was business. He wouldn't sell. He was stubborn. He was a father. Clara's voice rang out. Paddock looked up. Clara was standing at the edge of the destroyed path, aiming the Winchester down at them. She had climbed down the debris field. You killed him for rocks, Mr. Paddock, Clara said, her voice shaking with tears, but her aim true. You killed my husband for rocks. Clara, don't, Jericho warned softly. He's not worth the hangman's noose. Suddenly, Boone stirred. With a roar of desperation, he snatched a hidden derringer from his boot and aimed it at Clara. No. Jericho threw himself in front of the shot. Bang! The bullet hit Jericho in the chest. He stumbled back. But Boone didn't get a second shot. Clara fired the Winchester. The bullet struck the rock by Boone's feet, shattering the shale. Boone lost his footing. He flailed, grasping for Paddock's coat. Help me! Boone screamed. He grabbed Paddock's lapels. Paddock screamed as he was dragged forward. They teetered on the edge. The snow gave way. With a unified wail of terror, the 2 men, the greedy merchant and the hired killer, tumbled backward into the devil's throat. Their screams faded into the roar of the river below. The aftermath. April 1888, Jericho didn't die. The bullet had struck the silver flask in his breast pocket, a flask that had belonged to Liam. It was dented, ruining a good whiskey container, but saving a good man. The remaining gunmen were marched back to town and tied to the hitching post of the sheriff's office. When the townspeople heard Paddock was dead, the fear broke. The deputies, freed from Paddock's payroll, arrested the corrupt Sheriff Miller. Clara filed the claim for the Seraphim in Helena the next week. She was a rich woman, incredibly rich. but wealth changes things. Jericho stood on the porch of the cabin on Devil's Peak packing his saddlebags. The snow had melted, leaving the valley green and lush. Clara walked out holding 2 cups of coffee. She wore a new dress, blue silk, but her hair was loose, the copper shining in the sun. "Going somewhere?" she asked. "Job's done," Jericho said, not looking at her. "You're safe. You're rich. You can move to St. Louis. San Francisco. Give the boy a real life. And what about you?" "I belong on the mountain, Clara. I'm not a society man." Clara set the coffee down. She walked over to him and placed her hands on his face, forcing him to look at her. "You think this was about money?" she asked. "Jericho, you sold your gold to buy us flour. You bleeded for my son. You walked into chains for me." "I owed a debt," Jericho muttered. "The debt is paid," Clara said firmly. "Now, what do you want?" Jericho looked at her. He looked at Toby, who was playing in the meadow with the wooden horse, laughing. He looked at the empty cabin that had been a fortress of solitude, now filled with the scent of her baking and the sound of her voice. He took her hands in his massive, scarred paws. "I want to know if you can cook something other than venison stew." He grumbled, a small smile tugging at his beard. Clara laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "I make a pretty good apple pie, but I need someone to chop the wood for the oven." Jericho leaned down. This time he didn't kiss her forehead. He kissed her properly, a kiss that tasted of coffee, spring air, and a future that didn't hurt. "I'll chop the wood," Jericho whispered against her lips. "I'll chop all the wood." They didn't move to St. Louis. Clara used the gold to build a school in Banshee Creek and a proper hospital. She kept the cabin on Devil's Peak for summers. Jericho Kincaid never put the Marshal badge back on. He didn't need to. He was the husband of Clara O'Malley and the father of Toby O'Malley Kincaid. And every year, on the first snow, they would light a candle in the window. Not for the lost, but for the found. They say if you go to Banshee Creek today, there's a statue in the square. It's not of a general or a politician. It's a woman with long flowing hair holding a pair of shears in one hand and a mountain man's hand in the other. The inscription reads, "Bread feeds the body. Love feeds the soul." And that, folks, is the legend of the widow and the mountain man. A story that proves that sometimes the hardest hearts are just waiting for the right reason to break open. History is full of these hidden gems, stories of grit, survival, and love found in the most hopeless places. If this story moved you, or if you just think Jericho Kincaid is the kind of hero we need more of today, do me a favor. Smash that like button. It helps us find more lost legends to share with you. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification. We have a story coming next week about a saloon girl who outsmarted the railroad tycoons, and you do not want to miss it. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Would you have traded the hair or trusted the stranger? Let me know in the comments below. Stay wild, and I'll see you in the next chapter.